Tonight we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most dramatic, blood-soaked, and ultimately triumphant survival stories in the history of human civilization. The story of Poland. You're going to find out how a scattered medieval principality morphed into a colossal superpower, a nation whose troops actually occupied the Kremlin in Moscow, and whose legendary winged Hussars literally saved Europe from annihilation. But we're also going to look at the dark side of the coin. We'll explore exactly why that unprecedented greatness suddenly shattered, and how an entire nation, millions of people, was systematically erased from the map of the world for 123 years. You'll see how the Poles walked through the absolute hell of 20th century occupation, and how a group of everyday shipyard workers managed to stand up, look the Soviet system in the eye, and trigger the collapse of the entire Eastern Bloc. If you find yourself getting lost in this story, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what forgotten corner of history we should dig into next. Sit back and let's get into it. If you were to stand between the Oder and Vistula rivers in the early Middle Ages, you wouldn't see cities or roads. You would be looking at an endless, intimidating ocean of dense, primeval forests and treacherous swamps. This was the home of numerous Slavic tribes. They worshipped pagan gods, worked the unforgiving earth, and fiercely defended their small, fortified settlements from the constant raids of their neighbors. But slowly, one tribe began to rise above the rest, the Polans. They are the ones who would eventually give this land its name, and they founded the first ruling bloodline, a family that historians would later call the Piast dynasty. Local legend tells us that Piast was nothing more than a humble wheelwright, but destiny had a different script written for his descendants. They were the ones chosen to bind these fractured lands together under a single banner. By the mid-10th century, the process of uniting the Slavic clans around the strongholds of Gniezno and Poznan was in full swing. The first historically verified ruler of this new alliance was Duke Mieszko I. He inherited a formidable group of warriors and a massive stretch of territory from his ancestors. But make no mistake, the position of this young state was incredibly fragile. To the west, the Holy Roman Empire was aggressively pushing its borders. German feudal lords and bishops were marching east, using the conversion of pagans to Christianity as a convenient excuse for conquest. Mieszko saw the writing on the wall. He knew that if he didn't make a radical move, his people would be conquered, swallowed up, and assimilated. Meanwhile, pressure was also mounting from the south, from the Duchy of Bohemia, which had already adopted Christianity and wielded serious political leverage. In the year 965, Mieszko pulled off a geopolitical masterstroke that would dictate the destiny of the entire region for the next 1,000 years. He forged an alliance with the Bohemian ruler and married his daughter, Princess Dobrawa. 1 year later, in 966, Mieszko and his entire inner circle underwent the rite of baptism. Crucially, this baptism was done according to the Western Latin rite. Overnight, the geopolitical reality of the Polish lands was transformed. Mieszko flipped the script. He went from being a pagan target to a fully recognized European monarch. The German warlords instantly lost their moral justification to invade his lands under the banner of holy war. But this baptism brought more than just political cover. It brought the Latin alphabet, Western culture, and a unified administrative blueprint. Instead of dozens of competing tribal cults, there was now one shared faith acting as the glue for a newly emerging nation centered around their duke. Mieszko's son, Boleslav I, history remembers him as Boleslav the Brave, took his father's foundation and built an empire on it. He waged highly successful military campaigns, pushing the state's borders out in every direction. In the year 1000, he hosted the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III in Gniezno. That visit wasn't just a royal photo op. It cemented the absolute independence of the Polish Church. And in 1025, Boleslav the Brave took the ultimate step. He was crowned. becoming the first official king of Poland. The white eagle was firmly established as the symbol of the state. But this first golden era was destined to burn out fast. Once the strong rulers of the Piast dynasty died off, the family descended into brutal, bloody infighting. In 1138, King Boleslav III Wrymouth made a decision on his deathbed that would haunt the nation. He divided the country among his sons. His intentions were good. He genuinely wanted to prevent a fratricidal civil war over the throne. But his plan backfired spectacularly. Poland was plunged into a grueling 2-century-long nightmare of feudal fragmentation. The once mighty country shattered into a mosaic of tiny independent duchies. The local rulers spent their time at each other's throats, fighting endless petty wars over scraps of land and influence. This internal rot made the Polish lands incredibly vulnerable to predators from the outside. In the 13th century, a terrifying new global threat arrived from the east. The Mongol hordes of Batu Khan smashed into Europe, delivering a devastating blow to the Polish forces. In 1241, at the Battle of Legnica, the Polish knights were utterly annihilated, and Duke Henry the Pious was killed in the carnage. The Mongols eventually turned back, but they left the southern and central regions of the country completely gutted. Almost exactly at the same time, a catastrophic mistake was being made up north. Conrad, the Duke of Masovia, was exhausted from dealing with the constant raids of the pagan Prussian tribes, so in 1226 he made a fatal error in judgment. He invited the Teutonic Knights to come in and secure his borders. The German crusaders eagerly took the job. They swept in, brutally subduing the Prussians. But when it was time to hand the land back to the Polish Duke, they refused. Instead, they carved out their own heavily militarized theocratic state right on the Baltic coast. Instantly, the Teutonic Order morphed from a hired bodyguard into one of Poland's most lethal and aggressive enemies, completely cutting the country off from the Baltic Sea. The fragmented Polish duchies were bleeding out. The economy was wrecked by endless conflict, and neighboring powers were casually peeling away border territories. It was the sheer terror of total collapse that finally forced the Polish nobility and the church to wake up. The spark of reunification began in the early 14th century in the region of Kuyavia under a ruler named Władysław. He was nicknamed the Elbow High because of his short stature, but the man had the energy and stubbornness of a titan. Inch by inch, surviving defeats, exiles, and rebellions, he stitched the Polish lands back together. In 1320, his relentless grind paid off. In the city of Krakow, which from that moment on became the official capital and the site of royal coronations, Władysław placed the king's crown on his own head. That year officially closed the dark chapter of fragmentation and announced the rebirth of a united Polish kingdom. The country had survived, but it was a shadow of its former self. Its borders were shrunken, and its economy was lying in the dirt. Then in 1333, Władysław's son took the throne. His name was Casimir III, and both his contemporaries and modern historians know him simply as Casimir the Great. He is the only Polish king to ever receive that title, and he earned every bit of it. Casimir looked at his ruined country and realized that Poland simply could not afford to fight wars on all fronts. He was a geopolitical pragmatist and an absolute genius of diplomacy. He signed peace treaties with Bohemia and the Teutonic Order, strategically giving up some land in the north and west just to buy his country room to breathe. Instead of marching armies across Europe, Casimir focused his obsessive energy on nation building. He overhauled the courts and the administration. He introduced a single unified currency and standardized the laws, specifically protecting the rights of the peasants and the townsfolk against the nobility. Under his watch, Poland experienced a massive construction boom. Dozens of imposing stone castles and fortified city walls sprang up across the kingdom. There is a famous saying about Casimir the Great. He found a Poland made of wood and left it made of stone. Knowing that a great nation needs great minds, Casimir founded the Krakow Academy in 1364. It was only the second university in all of Central Europe, quickly becoming the intellectual beating heart of the region. He threw his weight behind international trade and, crucially, he opened Poland's doors to the Jewish populations who were facing violent persecution across Western Europe. This move brought a massive influx of capital, craftsmanship, and culture into the country. When Casimir the Great died in 1370, it was a turning point. He left no direct male heirs. His death marked the absolute end of the Piast dynasty, the bloodline that had ruled the land for over 400 years. The crown passed to his nephew, King Louis the Great of Hungary. And after Louis died, his youngest daughter, Jadwiga, was crowned King of Poland. Yes, she was crowned as king, to emphasize her absolute right to rule. Poland was standing at a massive historical crossroads. The country was united, rich, and culturally vibrant. But the Teutonic Knights up north were still a loaded gun pointed at their heads. Poland needed a new game-changing alliance to guarantee its survival. The era of the Piasts was over, but they had poured a foundation of concrete that the state could build upon. By the end of the 14th century, the Polish kingdom was in a tight spot. You had a young Queen Jadwiga sitting on the throne in Krakow, but the geopolitical reality demanded a heavy-hitting military leader who could hold the line against the Teutonic Order. The Polish lords turned their eyes to the east, looking toward the massive, sprawling Grand Duchy of Lithuania. At the time, Lithuania was the last major pagan state in Europe, and they were fighting their own exhausting, bloody war against the Teutonic Crusaders. The logic was simple. The enemy of my enemy is my brother. This shared existential threat pushed these two nations into an alliance that would literally redraw the map of Eastern Europe. In 1385, inside the dark stone walls of Kriva Castle, a destiny-altering treaty was signed. Under the Union of Krivo, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, agreed to convert to Latin Christianity along with his entire nation. He agreed to bind his massive eastern territories to the Polish crown, and he agreed to marry Queen Jadwiga. A year later, Jogaila was baptized in Krakow, took the Christian name Vladislav, and stepped up to the Polish throne. This was the dawn of the Jagiellonian dynasty, and overnight this royal marriage created an absolute geopolitical juggernaut. It was a bloc so massive and powerful that it could look any threat in Europe dead in the eye. The Teutonic Order instantly realized they were staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. The knights desperately tried to convince the Pope that the Lithuanian baptism was fake, a political scam, but the wheels of history were already in motion. They couldn't stop it. The tension along the borders became a powder keg. For years, it was a slow burn of border skirmishes and land disputes. But by the early 15th century, everyone knew a massive, apocalyptic clash was inevitable. Both sides spent years hoarding weapons and men for the final showdown. In the summer of 1410, the combined Polish-Lithuanian war machine, commanded by the king and his cousin, the Lithuanian Grand Duke Vytautas, marched straight for the Teutonic capital, the fortress of Marienburg. On July 15th, 1410, near the village of Grunwald, two of the greatest armies of the medieval world collided. On one side, you had the heavily armored, steel-clad German knights and elite mercenaries pulled from across Western Europe. On the other side, a massive coalition Polish regiments, Lithuanian light cavalry, and allied banners from Smolensk, Bohemia, and even Tatar warriors. The battle was an absolute meat grinder. The momentum swung violently back and forth throughout the day. But ultimately, the tactical brilliance of the Allied commanders and the sheer, stubborn grit of their men broke the German lines. The Teutonic Order didn't just lose, they were slaughtered. The entire upper echelon of the order, including the Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, was left dead in the mud. This spectacular victory permanently snapped the military spine of the Crusaders. They didn't manage to take Marienburg Castle right then, but the Teutonic march to the east was dead in its tracks. The prestige of this new Polish-Lithuanian Union skyrocketed to a level Europe hadn't seen before. Over the next few decades, the Jagiellonian dynasty became the ultimate power brokers of the region. Members of the family were sitting on the thrones of Bohemia and Hungary. Poland was aggressively expanding its diplomatic reach, dominating the Baltic trade routes and, slowly but surely, swallowing up the remaining Teutonic lands. In 1466, after a grinding 13 years' war, the Second Peace of Torun was signed. Poland officially took back its access to the Baltic Sea, securing the incredibly wealthy port city of Gdansk, and the Teutonic Order was forced to bend the knee, becoming a vassal to the Polish king. The final nail in the coffin came in 1525. The last Grand Master of the Order, Albrecht Hohenzollern, converted to Lutheranism, secularized the Teutonic lands, and publicly swore an oath of loyalty to the Polish king Sigismund I the Old, right in the middle of the main square in Krakow. The 16th century went down in the history books as Poland's undisputed golden age. The economy was running white hot. With total control of the Vistula River flowing up to the port of Gdansk, Poland essentially became the breadbasket of Europe. Polish grain was feeding the exploding populations of the Netherlands, England, and France. Rivers of gold flowed back into the country. The nobility used that cash to build sprawling, magnificent estates, while the kings transformed their fortresses. The Wawel Royal Castle in Krakow was packed with masterpieces brought in by Italian Renaissance architects, making it one of the most stunning palaces on the continent. And it wasn't just money, it was a cultural explosion. This was the century that gave the world Nicholas Copernicus, a brilliant mind out of the Krakow Academy who literally rearranged the universe by proving the Earth revolves around the sun. In literature, a writer named Jan Kochanowski was laying down the foundation for the modern Polish language. But maybe the most incredible feature of the Polish Golden Age was its religious tolerance. While Western Europe was tearing itself apart, drowning in the blood of the Protestant Reformation and religious civil wars, Poland was an island of sanity. It became a safe haven for Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews. In 1573, the Warsaw Confederation legally guaranteed freedom of religion. In a Christian world that was burning heretics at the stake, Poland legislated peace. But by the mid-16th century, the sky started to darken. The mighty Jagiellonian dynasty was running out of blood. King Sigismund II Augustus had no children. Without a royal heir to act as the human bridge between Poland and Lithuania, the entire alliance was in danger of snapping in half. At the exact same time, a terrifying storm was gathering in the east. The Tsardom of Russia, ruled by the infamous Ivan the Terrible, was expanding aggressively, waging the grueling Livonian War. If Poland and Lithuania wanted to survive what was coming, they couldn't just be allies anymore. They needed to fuse their loose partnership into a single, unbreakable federal state. Merging two massive nations is never easy. The Lithuanian magnates fought the idea tooth and nail. They were terrified that their independence and their elite privileges would be crushed under the weight of the much larger Polish nobility. The negotiations dragged on, deadlocked. So King Sigismund II Augustus played hardball. By royal decree, he simply stripped the southern territories away from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and annexed them directly into the Polish crown. He took away Lithuania's leverage and forced them back to the negotiating table. On July 1st, 1569, at a joint parliament in the city of Lublin, the ink dried on the Union of Lublin. This wasn't just a treaty, it was the birth certificate of a new superpower. It erased the divided governments and created a single federal state. They called it the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or in Latin, the res publica, the common thing. Under the Union of Lublin, the Commonwealth would be ruled by a single elected monarch who wore both the crown of Poland and the cap of the Grand Duke of Lithuania. They created a single supreme legislative body, the General Sejm. They unified the currency. They spoke with one voice in foreign policy. But Lithuania wasn't entirely swallowed up. They kept their own treasury, their own legal code, their own ministers, and crucially, their own army. The birth of the Commonwealth in 1569 was the absolute zenith of the Jagiellonian legacy, even though King Sigismund II Augustus died just 3 years later. What emerged on the map of Europe was a behemoth, a colossal empire stretching from the cold waters of the Baltic down to the shores of the Black Sea. It had bottomless resources, a booming culture, and a political system that was utterly alien to the rest of the world. Poland had reached its maximum territorial and political footprint. It was the anchor of stability in Eastern Europe. The balance of power was permanently altered, opening up a brand new chapter of history, one packed with legendary military triumphs, but hiding a fatal, slow-acting poison in its political veins. When the ink dried on the Union of Lublin and the last Jagiellonian king took his final breath, the Commonwealth found itself in an incredibly bizarre political reality. You had this mammoth superpower and suddenly no hereditary ruler. But instead of devolving into chaos and civil war, this vacuum gave birth to one of the most unique and radically different political systems in human history. They called it Nobles' Democracy, or the Golden Liberty. Think about what was happening in the rest of Europe. Kings in France and England were consolidating absolute, unchecked power. But in Poland and Lithuania, the real power shifted away from the throne and straight into the hands of the nobility, the szlachta. And this wasn't some tiny exclusive club. The Polish nobility made up a staggering 8 to 10% of the total population, a number unheard of anywhere else in Europe. Under the law, every single noble, whether he owned half the country or just the dirt on his boots, was considered absolutely equal. In 1573, at the very first election parliament, the nobility laid down the rules for how they would pick their kings. From that day forward, any noble had the right to physically ride out to a massive field outside Warsaw and cast his personal vote for the next monarch. The first guy they hired for the job was a French prince, Henry of Valois. But before they let him anywhere near the crown, they made him sign a brutal contract known as the Henrician Articles. These articles permanently neutered the power of the king and handed it over to the nobles' parliament the same. The king of the Commonwealth couldn't declare war, couldn't sign a peace treaty, couldn't raise taxes, and couldn't call up the army without the explicit permission of the parliament. And if the king broke his promises or tried to step on the nobles' rights, the law literally gave the nobility the right to legally rebel and overthrow him. They called it a rokos. Later on, the parliament adopted a rule that would become infamous. It was called the liberum veto, Latin for, I freely forbid. It meant that for any law to pass, the vote had to be 100% unanimous. A single deputy could stand up in the chamber, shout that phrase, and the entire session of Parliament was instantly dissolved, and every single law they had been working on was thrown in the trash. In the 16th century, the nobility viewed this as the ultimate safeguard of freedom, a shield against tyranny. But as time went on, it would mutate into a suicidal weapon that would destroy the state from the inside out. But despite this incredibly clunky, almost unworkable political engine the late 16th and early 17th centuries saw, the Commonwealth become an absolute terror on the battlefield. And the tip of the spear, the ultimate symbol of Polish military supremacy, was the winged Hussars. This was elite, heavy shock cavalry, manned exclusively by the wealthiest nobles. They rode into battle on massive, specially bred war horses, encased in heavy steel plate armor. But what made them legendary were the massive wooden frames strapped to their backs, covered in eagle goose or swan feathers. When these guys went into a full gallop, those wings created a loud, terrifying clatter that would spook enemy horses and inflict massive psychological trauma on the infantry waiting for the impact. Their primary weapon was a massive hollow wooden lance, sometimes stretching over 16 feet long, designed to shatter enemy infantry lines like glass. For decades, the winged Hussars were virtually undefeated. Led by tactical savants like Jan Karol Chodkiewicz and Stanislaw Żółkiewski, the Polish cavalry routinely obliterated armies 2 or 3 times their size. Take the Battle of Kirkum in 1605. Just 3,500 Polish-Lithuanian troops, spearheaded by the Hussars, completely dismantled an 11,000-strong Swedish army. The Hussars just kept slamming into dense Swedish infantry squares, physically ripping them to shreds through sheer kinetic force. The whole of Europe was whispering about the invincible Polish horsemen. During this same era, the Commonwealth plunged its hands deep into the affairs of its eastern neighbor, Russia. The Tsardom was going through an apocalyptic collapse known as the Time of Troubles. The Rurik dynasty had died out, impostors were claiming the throne, and the Polish magnates saw a golden opportunity to grab land and power. In 1610, a massive combined Swedish and Russian army tried to stop the Polish advance toward Smolensk. They collided at the Battle of Klusino. The Polish commander, Stanislaw Żółkiewski, had fewer than 7,000 men. He was staring down a coalition force of almost 35,000. What followed was a tactical masterclass. The winged Hussars charged the enemy pikemen and barricades over and over again dozens of times until the Russian resistance totally collapsed. The victory at Klusino blew the doors to Moscow wide open. The Russian boyars overthrew their own Tsar, Vasily Shuisky, and actually recognized the Polish prince, Vladislav, the son of the Polish king Sigismund III, as the new Tsar of Russia. By the fall of 1610, a Polish garrison under Alexander Gosiewski casually walked into Moscow and took over the Kremlin without a fight. Polish generals ran the Kremlin for 2 years, until a massive popular uprising led by Kuzma Minin and Dmitry Pozharsky besieged them and starved them into surrendering in 1612. Even so, the resulting Truce of Dulino handed Poland massive territories, including Smolensk and Chernihiv. The Commonwealth had reached its absolute maximum size in the east. But Russia wasn't the only problem. Down south, the state was locked in a constant bleeding war against Tatar raids from Crimea and the terrifying advance of the Ottoman Empire. In 1620, the Poles took a brutal beating from the Turks at Chikora, where the old general Żółkiewski died a hero's death. But they bounced back the very next year. At the fortress of Chocim, a combined Polish-Cossack army of about 35,000 men, commanded by Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, dug into the mud and survived a relentless siege by an Ottoman army of over 100,000 troops, led by Sultan Osman II. That heroic stand at Chocim stopped the Islamic invasion of Christian Europe, dead in its tracks, forcing the Ottomans to sign a peace treaty. By the mid-17th century, the Commonwealth looked like an untouchable titan. It spanned nearly 1 million square kilometers. The nobility genuinely believed they had built the most perfect, free, and secure nation on planet Earth. The capital was permanently moved from Krakow to Warsaw by King Sigismund III, who built the famous column honoring his father that still stands today. The cities were rich. The culture of Sarmatism, a wild mix of Eastern Oriental luxury and Western chivalry, was at its absolute peak. But behind the velvet and the gold, the foundation was rotting. That golden liberty had mutated. It was no longer about freedom. It was about the naked greed of massive aristocratic families. They started using the liberum veto to paralyze the central government just to protect their own profit margins. The power of the king was eroding, and the army. Despite the terrifying reputation of the Hussars, the military was actually incredibly small, simply because the nobility refused to vote for the taxes required to pay a standing army. Under the surface, the country was a pressure cooker of social and religious tension, especially in the wild southeastern borderlands, where Orthodox Cossacks and peasants were being ground into the dirt by Catholic Polish lords. And then came the year 1648. The year the illusion of invincibility was violently shattered. pushing the most prosperous republic in Europe to the absolute brink of extinction. In 1648, the Commonwealth's golden facade collapsed practically overnight. Down in the southeastern borderlands along the Dnieper River, a massive explosive rebellion erupted, led by the Cossack hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky. The Cossacks, who had spent decades begging for basic rights and religious freedom, finally had enough. They struck a deal with the Crimean Tatars and unleashed a wave of devastation on the Polish royal army. The battles at Jowty Wody and Korsun were absolute bloodbaths. They proved to the world that the Polish military machine was no longer invincible. What started as a border revolt instantly mutated into a savage civil war that swallowed half the country and wiped out hundreds of thousands of lives. The Polish government was entirely incapable of putting out the fire. The parliament was paralyzed by infighting, and there was no strong commander at the wheel. The war dragged on for years, bleeding the state dry. Then in 1654, Khmelnytsky signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav with the Tsardom of Russia. Suddenly, massive Russian armies were pouring across the eastern borders to back the Cossacks. They rolled over Smolensk, Mogilev, and Vilnius, pushing all the way to Brest. The Polish state apparatus completely short-circuited. The treasury was empty, and the nobles were too busy arguing to raise an army. Sensing the smell of blood in the water, King Charles X, Gustav of Sweden, decided it was time to move in for the kill. In the summer of 1655, the Swedish war machine, one of the most modern, disciplined, and lethal armies on the planet, smashed into Poland from two directions. This nightmare is remembered in Polish history as the Deluge. Because the enemy didn't just invade, they flooded the entire kingdom. The Swedish advance faced almost zero resistance. The noble militias in Greater Poland just threw down their weapons and surrendered. Over in Lithuania, the Grand Hetman, Janusz Radziwiłł, actually signed a treaty recognizing the Swedish king as his ruler. The Polish king John II Casimir was forced to abandon his country and run for his life to Silesia. The Swedes casually marched into Warsaw and the ancient capital of Krakow. And then the looting began. The occupiers stripped the country down to the studs. They burned villages, slaughtered civilians, and packed up entire libraries, museum collections, church gold, and even the architectural stonework from castles, shipping it all back to Sweden. The economic devastation of the Swedish deluge is hard to even comprehend. Historians estimate that Poland lost over a third of its entire population. Major economic hubs were reduced to smoking craters, and it would take generations to rebuild them. Poland was looking into the abyss of total annihilation. But the turning point in this apocalyptic war didn't come from a grand army. It came from a monastery. In the winter of 1655, a small garrison of monks and soldiers at the Jasna Gora Monastery in Częstochowa dug in and miraculously held off a massive Swedish siege for weeks. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a spiritual shockwave. It proved the Swedes could bleed. Suddenly the whole country caught fire. Nobles, peasants, and city dwellers started forming guerrilla bands, launching vicious hit-and-run attacks on Swedish garrisons. King John Casimir returned from exile, walked into a cathedral in Lviv, and made a solemn vow, crowning the Virgin Mary as the Queen of Poland and promising to lift the heavy burdens off the peasant class once the war was won. Led by a brilliant and ruthless commander named Stefan Czarnecki, the Polish forces embraced a fluid, highly mobile guerrilla war, slowly bleeding the Swedes and pushing them back toward the sea. Eventually, Austria and Denmark jumped into the war against Sweden, forcing the Swedes to finally pack up and leave. In 1660, the Treaty of Oliva was signed. The borders went back to where they were before the war, though Poland officially gave up its claims to Livonia. 7 years later, in 1667, the Truce of Andrusovo ended the agonizing war with Russia. The cost was massive. Poland permanently lost left bank Ukraine, Smolensk, and Kiev. The Commonwealth survived the deluge, but it was a zombie state. The political system was in a state of terminal decay. It was during this exact period that the liberum veto was used for the first time to completely blow up a session of Parliament. Running the country was becoming a dark comedy. Exhausted, broken, and sick of fighting the anarchy of his own nobles, King John Casimir voluntarily abdicated the throne in 1668. Before he walked out the door, he stood in front of the Parliament and delivered a chilling, prophetic warning. If the nobility did not abandon their insane, selfish freedoms, the country would inevitably be torn to pieces and swallowed by its three neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. But before the sun finally set on the Commonwealth, it had one last blinding flash of military glory left in the tank. In the late 17th century, the titanic struggle with the Ottoman Empire flared up again. The man holding the line was a military genius named John Sobieski. He had battered the Turks so badly at Chosim that the nobles elected him King John III. In the summer of 1683, a gargantuan Ottoman army led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa swept into Austria and locked a suffocating siege ring around Vienna. If Vienna fell, the road into the very heart of Europe was wide open. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I was desperate. He begged the Polish king for help. John III Sobieski didn't hesitate. He pulled together 20,000 Polish troops and force-marched them south, linking up with German and Austrian forces along the way. On September 12, 1683, the Battle of Vienna began. The Allied Christian armies attacked the Ottoman positions from the slopes of the Kahlenberg Hill. The climax of the battle hit in the late afternoon. King Sobieski personally drew his sword and led the charge. 20,000 heavy cavalrymen, including 3,000 winged Hussars, came roaring down the mountain like a steel avalanche, straight into the Ottoman camp. It remains one of the largest cavalry charges in the history of human warfare. The kinetic impact was catastrophic. The Hussars shattered the Turkish lines, instantly vaporizing the Ottoman defense. The Turks broke and ran in absolute panic, leaving behind their artillery, their war chest, and their flags. Sobieski's triumph at Vienna saved Central Europe from Islamic conquest, and he was hailed as the savior of the Christian world. But here's the tragedy of Vienna: that spectacular victory did almost nothing for Poland. They had burned their remaining strength fighting someone else's war. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz gave Poland back Podolia and the fortress of Kamieniec, but it was just window dressing. As the 17th century closed the era of great wars, the Piast and the Jagiellones was dead and buried. The Commonwealth stumbled into the 18th century as a hollow shell, economically ruined, politically paralyzed, and surrounded by empires that were just waiting for the right moment to carve it up. As the 18th century dawned, the Commonwealth was dragged straight into the meat grinder of a massive European crisis. The man sitting on the Polish throne was a Saxon Elector Augustus II the Strong from the House of Wettin. He made the disastrous decision to ally with the Russian Tsar Peter the Great and pull Poland into the devastating Great Northern War against Sweden. Officially, the Commonwealth tried to claim neutrality for a long time, but reality didn't care. Polish territory was turned into a free-for-all military testing ground. Swedish, Russian, and Saxon armies casually marched back and forth across the country for years. They looted the cities, burned the crops, and bled the civilian population dry. The economy, which had barely started to limp back to life after the horrors of the previous century, was completely flatlined again. But the real cancer killing the state was absolute political paralysis. That golden liberty, specifically the liberum veto, had become a weapon of mass destruction. Mega-rich, aristocratic families, entirely obsessed with their own bank accounts and vendettas, would literally pay off broke, desperate noblemen to walk into the national parliament and scream, "I forbid." During the entire reign of Augustus II and his son Augustus III, dozens of parliaments were called into session. Out of all of them, only a tiny handful managed to actually finish their work and pass a single law. The government was functionally brain dead. There was no standing army, the courts were a joke, the national treasury was empty, and right across the border, the absolutist empires of Russia, Prussia, and Austria were watching this slow-motion suicide with absolute delight. They actively funded the anarchy. They cynically told the world they were just stepping in to, quote, guarantee the traditional freedoms of the Polish nobility, while actually tying the noose around the country's neck. In 1764, backed by the raw political and military muscle of the Russian Empress Catherine the Great, the last king of the Commonwealth took the throne, Stanislaw August Poniatowski. He was a highly educated man, a product of the Enlightenment and a genuine patriot. He immediately tried to stop the bleeding. He tried to restrict the suicidal liberum veto. He opened a military academy to train real officers, tried to fix the financial system, and started building modern factories. But it was too little too late. His reforms triggered a violent backlash from the ultra-conservative Polish nobles, and it set off alarm bells in the neighboring empires who absolutely did not want a functional, strong Poland. In 1768, a faction of patriotic old-school nobles formed the Bar Confederation and launched a massive armed rebellion against the king and the suffocating grip of Russian influence. The country exploded into a brutal 4-year civil war. Russian troops flooded into the Republic to crush the rebels. Looking at this totally helpless, bleeding state, the rulers in St. Petersburg, Berlin, and Vienna decided it was time to eat. In 1772, they signed a secret pact in St. Petersburg. This was the first partition of Poland. The Russian Empire sliced off the eastern edge of Belarus and the Baltics. Prussia grabbed the strategically vital region of Pomerania and the mouth of the Vistula River, completely cutting Poland off from the sea. Austria swallowed the heavily populated southern region of Galicia, including the city of Lviv. In a single stroke of a pen, the Commonwealth lost 30% of its land and a third of its population. That brutal amputation acted like a bucket of ice water to the face of the Polish public. A massive wave of patriotism and Enlightenment thinking swept through the country. The reformers rallied around the king. In 1788, the Parliament convened for what would become known as the Great Sejm. For 4 years, these lawmakers worked frantically to completely rewrite the DNA of the state. This culminated on May 3, 1791, when the Sejm officially adopted the Constitution of the Commonwealth. It was an absolute political earthquake. It was the first modern written constitution in Europe and the second in the world, right behind the United States Constitution. The May 3rd Constitution took a sledgehammer to the liberum veto, banning it forever. It abolished the chaotic election of kings, turning Poland into a stable, hereditary constitutional monarchy. It strengthened the executive branch, gave political rights to the townspeople, and placed the peasant class under the legal protection of the state. It also mandated the creation of a modern, 100,000-strong standing army. This document was the blueprint for a modern, powerful nation. It was Poland's ticket to survival. But that sudden burst of strength terrified the surrounding empires, and predictably, the conservative Polish elites, furious about losing their VIP privileges, formed the Targowica Confederation and literally begged the Russian army to invade their own country. The new constitutional army fought like hell, but the math just wasn't there. King Stanislaw August, completely broken and convinced the war was unwinnable, surrendered and joined the Confederates. The reforms were ripped up. In 1793, the hammer fell again. The Second Partition. This time it was just Russia and Prussia. The Prussian war machine swallowed the ancient cradle of the Polish state, Poznan, Gniezno, and Gdansk. The Russian Empire carved out massive chunks of Lithuania, Belarus, and right bank Ukraine. The once mighty Commonwealth was reduced to a tiny, pathetic buffer zone, completely occupied by foreign troops. With the gun pressed firmly to the head of the nation, the Polish people made one final desperate lunge for freedom. In March 1794, in the main square of Krakow, a nationwide armed uprising was declared. The man leading it was Tadeusz Kościuszko, a brilliant military engineer, and a certified hero of the American Revolutionary War. Kosciuszko was a visionary. He knew he couldn't beat empires with just noblemen. He needed the masses. He issued the Polonyak Manifesto, promising personal freedom to the peasants and slashing their forced labor requirements. It worked. At the Battle of WWII, peasant militias armed with nothing but modified farming scythes did the impossible. They charged head first into the blazing cannons of the Russian artillery, slaughtered the gunners, and captured the batteries, handing the rebellion a massive tactical victory. The uprising spread like wildfire through Warsaw and Lithuania. But passion doesn't win wars of attrition. They were fighting on multiple fronts against the endless manpower of two global empires. In the fall of 1794, at the Battle of Maciejowice, the Polish army was crushed. Kosciuszko was severely wounded and dragged off to a Russian prison. Shortly after, Russian columns commanded by the ruthless General Alexander Suvorov stormed Praga, the fortified suburb of Warsaw. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The Russians slaughtered the civilian population in the streets. Warsaw surrendered. The uprising was dead. The fatal blow landed in 1795. Russia, Prussia, and Austria met one last time for the third partition. They wiped the remaining scraps of the Commonwealth off the board. Warsaw was handed to Prussia, Krakow went to Austria, Vilnius was swallowed by Russia. The last king, Stanislav August Poniatowski, was forced to sign his own abdication papers. The three emperors signed a secret treaty, swearing to never use the words Kingdom of Poland in any diplomatic document ever again. Just like that, a massive Slavic superpower that had dictated the fate of Eastern Europe for centuries was completely deleted from the map of the world. The nation had lost its sovereignty, plunging into a dark, suffocating 123-year nightmare. The erasure of the state in 1795 was a catastrophic psychological blow, but it did not break the spine of the Polish people. Stripped of their borders and divided among three ruthless empires, the Poles immediately started plotting their resurrection. Their eyes turned toward revolutionary France, which was busy tearing down the old monarchies of Europe. In 1797, down in northern Italy, under the umbrella of a rising general named Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous Polish legions were born. It was right there in the military camps that a poet named Józef Wybicki sat down and penned a marching song. The first line read, "Poland has not yet perished so long as we still live." That song fueled the men in combat, and today it is the official national anthem of Poland. The gamble on Napoleon actually paid out, at least for a moment. In 1807, after smashing the Prussian army, the French emperor took a chunk of former Polish territory and created the Duchy of Warsaw. It was a French puppet state, but the Poles finally had their own constitution, their own army, and a modern civil code. They bled for Napoleon in every campaign he fought, including the catastrophic march into the freezing hell of Moscow in 1812. But when Napoleon's empire finally collapsed in 1815, the Duchy of Warsaw went down with it. At the Congress of Vienna, the victorious powers chopped up the map of Europe all over again. The bulk of the Polish lands was handed over to the Russian Empire, rebranded as Congress Poland. At first, Tsar Alexander I played the benevolent ruler. He gave the region a surprising amount of autonomy and its own constitution. But the honeymoon didn't last. Slowly but surely, the Russian imperial machine started tightening the screws, rolling back freedoms, ramping up censorship, and hunting down secret patriotic student groups. The pressure gauge finally blew on November 29, 1830. A group of young Polish military cadets stormed the Belvedere Palace in Warsaw, trying to assassinate the Russian viceroy. Regular Polish army units joined the mutiny. The Polish parliament officially stripped Tsar Nicholas I of his right to the Polish throne. This wasn't a riot, it was a full-blown Polish-Russian war. In the spring of 1831, the Polish army, led by brilliant tacticians, fought like demons against the overwhelming numbers of the Russian Field Marshal Debich. They actually pulled off stunning victories at places like Grochow and Ostrolenka. But internal backstabbing among the Polish leaders, combined with absolute silence from the Western powers, who refused to help, doomed the uprising. By the fall of 1831, Russian troops under General Paskevich battered their way into Warsaw. The November uprising was crushed, and the payback was brutal. Nicholas I shredded the Polish constitution, boarded up the University of Warsaw, and launched a massive, aggressive campaign of Russification. Thousands of Polish fighters were slapped in chains and death-marched to Siberia, while their family estates were handed out to Russian bureaucrats. The exact same cultural strangulation was happening in the territories held by Prussia and Austria. The empires were actively trying to beat the Polish language and identity out of the population. During this incredibly dark era, when picking up a rifle was a suicide mission, the battlefield shifted to the mind. The great Polish culture of the Romantic era stepped up and became the spiritual fortress of the nation. Following the disaster of 1831, the Great Emigration began. The brightest minds of Poland fled to Paris, turning it into the cultural capital of a ghost country. It was in Paris that the absolute genius Frédéric Chopin wrote his immortal masterpieces. He didn't need words, he weaponized the piano. He took the pain, the rage, and the pride of his people and encoded it into his mazurkas and polonaises. Chopin's music echoed around the globe, forcing the high society of Europe to remember that Poland was still breathing. Alongside him was the titanic poet Adam Mickiewicz. His epic poem Pan Tadeusz and his dramatic plays acted like a defibrillator for the Polish soul, convincing the people that spiritual rebirth and freedom were inevitable. 30 years passed. A new generation of patriots grew up, and they were itching for a fight. On January 22, 1863, the January uprising exploded. But this time, there was no regular Polish army. This was a desperate, sprawling, underground guerrilla war. A secret national government ran the entire operation from the shadows of Warsaw. Rebel bands, armed with nothing but hunting rifles and scythes, launched ambush attacks on Russian garrisons from the cover of the deep forests. The fighting bled over the borders into Lithuania and Belarus. The Russian response was terrifying. They poured a massive army into the region and handed control to Governor-General Mikhail Muravyov, a man whose brutal tactics of mass terror and public hangings earned him the nickname the Hangman. The last dictator of the uprising, Romuald Traugott, desperately tried to hold the rebel forces together, but in the spring of 1864, he was dragged into the Warsaw citadel and hanged. By the end of the year, the last embers of resistance were stomped out. The January uprising was a catastrophic failure. The Tsarist government completely liquidated whatever autonomy was left. Speaking Polish in schools or government buildings became a criminal offense. Over in the West, the Prussian government, under Otto von Bismarck, was running a similarly ruthless Germanization campaign known as the Kulturkampf. Faced with this suffocating oppression, the Polish people at the end of the 19th century pivoted. They realized that romantic doomed rebellions were just getting their best young men killed. They shifted to a hyper-pragmatic strategy known as organic work. They stopped fighting with swords and started fighting with economics and education. They built modern factories. They ran secret underground schools to teach their kids the Polish language and true history. The cultural torch was passed to the novelist Henryk Sienkiewicz. He wrote massive, blockbuster historical epics about the military glory of the past, like With Fire and Sword, and the global phenomenon Quo Vadis. Millions read his work, and it injected a heavy dose of pride and resilience directly into the veins of the nation. As the 20th century dawned, the geopolitical tectonic plates in Europe started to grind together. The Poles knew that their only ticket out of this prison was a massive, catastrophic war between the three empires holding their leashes. In 1914, the powder keg blew. World War I began. Russia was suddenly locked in a death match against Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a tragedy. Poles were drafted into 3 different imperial armies, frequently forced to shoot at each other across the trenches. But the nation's leaders saw the crack in the armor. A brilliant, hardened political operator named Józef Pilsudski started building new Polish legions down in Galicia, training a hardcore military cadre that would eventually secure a free state. 1918 was approaching. The century-old dream of millions of people was about to violently claw its way out of the rubble of the fallen empires. By the fall of 1918, the apocalyptic meat grinder of World War I was finally grinding to a halt. The 3 massive empires that had kept Poland locked in a cage for over a century completely imploded. The Russian Empire had been consumed by the fire of the Bolshevik Revolution and Civil War, while Germany and Austria-Hungary tapped out and surrendered to the Allies. On November 11th, 1918, in Warsaw, Józef Pilsudski stepped up and took command of the newly formed national military. That day is etched in history as the official rebirth of the Second Polish Republic. But this wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a logistical nightmare. The new government had to build a country entirely from scratch, trying to fuse together 3 regions that had spent a century operating under totally different legal codes, currencies, and railroad gauges. Worse, nobody had drawn the borders of this new republic. Poland had to carve its borders out in blood fighting, a series of brutal, grinding conflicts. The absolute ultimate test came with the Polish-Soviet War. By the summer of 1920, the Red Army, commanded by Mikhail Tukhachevsky, was rolling westward like a juggernaut. Their goal wasn't just Poland. They wanted to spread the fire of the communist revolution into Germany and across all of Europe. The Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The survival of the Polish state was hanging by a thread. But in August 1920, the tide turned in what history calls the miracle on the Vistula. Pilsudski engineered a wildly dangerous, brilliantly executed counterattack from the southern flank. The Polish troops sliced right through the Soviet lines, shattering the Red Army and sending them running. That victory didn't just save Poland from being swallowed by the Soviet machine. It locked in the eastern border at the 1921 Treaty of Riga, and it single-handedly stopped the spread of communism into Western Europe for 2 decades. The interwar period was a roller coaster for the Second Republic. They pulled off massive achievements like building the ultramodern seaport of Gdynia from scratch on the Baltic coast and establishing a massive central industrial zone. But it was also a time of brutal economic suffering, triggered by the Great Depression and deep political instability. In 1926, frustrated with the chaos, Pilsudski launched the May coup, installing a tough authoritarian government known as the Sanation regime. But the real nightmare was geography. Poland was trapped in a vice between 2 of the most aggressive, psychotic, totalitarian regimes in human history: Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. In August 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Hidden inside that treaty was a secret protocol, a blueprint for the 4th partition of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, the Nazi war machines smashed into Poland, officially kicking off World War II. The Polish military fought like lions, mounting heroic, desperate defenses at Westerplatte, Modlin, and Warsaw. Then on September 17th, the Soviet Red Army stabbed them in the back, invading from the east. Crushed between the 2 most powerful armies on earth, the regular Polish forces were defeated. But Poland never officially surrendered. A Polish government in exile was immediately set up in London. Back home in the shadows of the occupation, they built something entirely unique: the Polish underground state, complete with its own massive, highly organized military wing, the Home Army, or Armia Krajowa. The occupation was a period of unimaginable industrial-scale terror. The Nazis systematically hunted down and executed the Polish intelligentsia, teachers, priests, politicians. They turned Polish soil into the epicenter of the Holocaust, constructing the horrifying death camps where they murdered millions of European Jews and hundreds of thousands of ethnic Poles. In 1943, the doomed prisoners of the Warsaw Ghetto rose up, choosing to die with weapons in their hands rather than wait for the gas chambers. Meanwhile, in the Soviet-occupied East, the NKVD was busy packing hundreds of thousands of Poles into cattle cars and shipping them off to the frozen gulags of Siberia. In the spring of 1940, in the dark woods of Katyn and other killing fields, the Soviets put a bullet in the back of the head of over 20,000 captive Polish military officers. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army was rapidly pushing the Germans back and approaching Warsaw. The leaders of the Polish underground made a desperate, agonizing calculation. They had to launch a massive uprising to liberate their own capital before the Soviets arrived to prove they were a sovereign nation. On August 1st, 1944, the legendary Warsaw Uprising began. For 63 days of absolute hell, poorly armed Home Army fighters and everyday civilians fought savage, room-to-room urban combat against elite, heavily armed SS and Wehrmacht units. And the Soviet Army? They just stopped. They parked their tanks on the right bank of the Vistula River and watched the city burn. Stalin even refused to let American bombers use Soviet airstrips to drop supply crates to the dying fighters. Abandoned by the world, the Warsaw Uprising drowned in blood. Nearly 200,000 civilians were killed. In a fit of rage, Hitler ordered his engineers to physically wipe Warsaw off the face of the earth. The entire city center was wired with explosives and blown to dust. In 1945, World War II ended with an Allied victory. But for Poland, victory just meant trading one master for another. At the conferences of Yalta and Potsdam, the leaders of the free world sat down with Stalin and casually redrew Poland's borders without even asking the Poles. The Soviet Union permanently annexed Poland's eastern half. As a consolation prize, Poland was handed former German territories in the west and north, including cities like Wrocław, Szczecin, and Gdansk. The entire country was literally picked up and shoved hundreds of miles to the west. And on this new map, backed by the guns of the Red Army and the terror of Soviet intelligence, a ruthless communist regime was hammered into place. Opposition parties were wiped out. Elections were blatantly rigged. The anti-communist resistance fighters who stayed in the woods, known today as the cursed soldiers, were hunted down, tortured, and executed. Poland was officially rebranded as the Polish People's Republic. It was locked behind the Iron Curtain, formally chained to Moscow via the Warsaw Pact in 1955. But despite the communist government seizing every factory and forcing Marxist propaganda down everyone's throat, the Polish people never stopped fighting back. The Polish Catholic Church stood like a fortress of spiritual defiance. And the working class, pushed to the breaking point by empty grocery shelves and suffocating police control, kept exploding into massive strikes. In 1956, the workers in Poznan rose up. In 1970, the Baltic coast erupted in bloody clashes. In 1976, Radom and Ursus went on strike. The communist riot police brutally crushed every single one of these protests. But with every swing of the baton, the foundation of the regime cracked a little more. As the late 1970s approached, the pressure inside Polish society was building toward a critical mass, a force that was about to peacefully tear down the entire socialist architecture of the Eastern Bloc. By the end of the 1970s, the Polish People's Republic was driving straight into a brick wall. The command economy was a complete joke. It couldn't even keep basic food on the shelves. The national debt was exploding, and the secret police kept a boot on the neck of any political dissent. But in the middle of this suffocating despair, a massive shockwave hit the country, and it came from the Vatican. In October 1978, for the first time in history, a Polish cardinal named Karol Wojtyła was elected pope, taking the name John Paul II. When he returned to his homeland for an official visit, millions of people flooded the streets. The Pope's words didn't just offer spiritual comfort, they acted like a psychological defibrillator. He reminded the Poles of their human dignity. He showed them that when they stood together, they possessed a raw, unstoppable power that the communist state ideology simply could not match. The spark caught fire in the summer of 1980. Enraged by yet another spike in food prices, a massive wave of labor strikes swept across the country. Ground zero was the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. A shipyard electrician named Lech Wałęsa climbed over the fence, took charge of the strike committee, and instantly became the voice of the people. The workers weren't just asking for better wages anymore. They demanded the unthinkable, the right to form independent, self-governing labor unions, totally free from government control. The regime was backed into a corner and blinked. On August 31st, the historic Gdansk Agreement was signed, birthing the independent trade union known as Solidarity. Within a matter of months, Solidarity wasn't just a union, it was a tidal wave. Nearly 10 million people voluntarily signed up. It transformed into the largest peaceful resistance movement against a communist dictatorship the world had ever seen. Over in Moscow, the Soviet leadership was watching this unfold with absolute dread, terrified that they were losing their grip on the most critical piece of the Eastern Bloc. Feeling the heat from the Kremlin, the new Polish leader, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, decided to pull the plug. In the dead of night on December 13, 1981, Jaruzelski declared martial law. Heavy tanks and armored personnel carriers rolled into the snowy streets. Solidarity was outlawed. Lech Wałęsa and thousands of activists were dragged from their beds and thrown into internment camps. Martial law dragged on for 3 suffocating years. It managed to put the regime on life support and force the opposition underground, but it couldn't fix the rot in the system. By the late 1980s, the Polish economy was a corpse. Hyperinflation was destroying the currency, and you couldn't find a single thing to buy in the stores. At the exact same time, Mikhail Gorbachev was rolling out perestroika in the Soviet Union, meaning the Polish communists could no longer rely on Soviet tanks to save them. Realizing the game was over, Jaruzelski's government did something completely unprecedented in the communist world. They sat down at the table with the very people they had thrown in prison. From February to April 1989, the famous Round Table Talks took place in Warsaw. The Communists and Solidarity hammered out a peaceful blueprint to transition the country. They agreed to legalize the union, create the office of the president, and hold partially free parliamentary elections. On June 4th, 1989, the people went to the ballot box. The results were an absolute massacre for the ruling party. Solidarity candidates captured 100% of the freely contested seats in the Senate and 99% of the available seats in the Sejm. The communist regime was stripped of all legitimacy. By September, a man named Tadeusz Mazowiecki took the oath as the first non-communist prime minister in the Eastern Bloc. The Third Polish Republic was born. This peaceful dismantling of a dictatorship acted like a lit match dropped in a powder keg. It triggered a massive chain reaction across Eastern Europe, directly leading to the sledgehammers hitting the Berlin Wall and the ultimate implosion of the Soviet Union. In December 1990, Lech Wałęsa, the shipyard electrician, was elected the first president of a truly free Poland. But freedom came with a brutal hangover. The new government inherited a toxic wasteland of hyperinflation and crushing foreign debt. The Minister of Finance, Leszek Balcerowicz, engineered a radical, aggressive economic overhaul that the world now knows as shock therapy. It was a brutally painful surgery. Unprofitable, bloated, state-owned factories were shuttered overnight. Unemployment skyrocketed. Government subsidies vanished. But the shock worked. It killed the hyperinflation dead in its tracks, rebooted the economy on free market principles, and opened the floodgates for massive foreign investment. Poland became the very first post-communist country to claw its way out of the recession. kicking off a staggering run of long-term economic growth. With the economy stabilizing, the Third Republic focused on its ultimate geopolitical goal, locking itself into the Western world and bulletproofing its borders against any future threats from the East. On March 12, 1999, Poland officially crossed the threshold and became a full-fledged member of NATO. Then, on May 1, 2004, they hit the final milestone, joining the European Union. Integration with the West paid out massive dividends. Fueled by billions in EU development funds, the country went into overdrive. Thousands of miles of modern highways were laid down, city infrastructures were completely overhauled, and the agricultural sector was modernized. In the 3 decades since the Iron Curtain was torn down, Poland has pulled off an absolute miracle. It went from a gray, decaying, Soviet-dominated satellite state to one of the most dynamic, rock-solid, and aggressive economies in all of Europe. Warsaw has transformed into a glowing, hyper-modern metropolis of glass and steel, acting as the financial and tech heavyweight of the region. Today, Poland isn't just sitting at the table, it's driving European policy, standing as the heavily armed, unbreakable eastern shield of the Western world. The story of this nation, from the baptism of the Piasts and the glory of the Jagiellons, through the nightmare of the partitions and the sheer hell of the 20th century, proves one undeniable truth. You can burn their cities, you can erase their borders, but the human drive for freedom can survive any catastrophe history throws at it, and ultimately reclaim its rightful place on the world stage.